What's up, fellas? I decided I would do a quick video tonight. Trying to keep on top of being reasonably responsible with a high upload frequency because I reckon that's relatively important. So I shot Max a text. I said, "Hey, Max, what's a simple video that you think people would appreciate that I can just do tonight without that much preparation?" And he said, "Well, why don't you come up with a list of, common powerlifting mistakes, common reasons you see people at the gym aren't progressing. That way people can look through, and, if they're honest with themselves, they say, all right, here's the question. Am I progressing at the rate I would like to? If the answer is yes, keep doing what you're doing. You don't even have to watch the video. Just keep doing what you're doing and then assess when that's no longer the case. But if the answer is no, like it is for a lot of people, if you can be honest with yourself, drop your ego. I think ego is a very important part of lifting. I think that's what allows you to believe that you're stronger than you were the last time you maxed out, and that's why you can do more weight. So I think that people without sufficient ego really struggle with the confidence when approaching heavy weights, but then some people have too much ego. They're constantly overestimating what they can do. Instead of taking a 5-pound PR, they jump to a 20-pound PR and they miss, and then they're also maybe not as good at assessing where they're falling short. So, like anything else, you can kind of find yourself, dial yourself back as far as ego, ramp it up, just to maximize your results, but, take a medium amount of ego, and if you're not progressing at the rate you would like, look at this list and say, hey, I'm guilty of that one, and I could fix that, and that would probably improve my rate of progression. That's my hope, is to create a little 6-bullet point list of common reasons I see people aren't progressing in their powerlifting training. The first one, just looking around at the gyms I've trained at, just powerlifting gyms, the YMCA, my school gym, all the gyms I've trained at, just looking around, the most common reason people aren't progressing is because they just don't try hard enough. The effort isn't there. To see adaptation, we need to apply a novel stimulus. To apply a novel stimulus after you've trained for any meaningful amount of time is going to require a pretty high level of effort. And I don't think that most people are reaching that level of effort. More often than not, on the compounds, on the accessories, I just don't see people training hard enough to drive any meaningful adaptation. So I think that would be the first one, is just training hard. Not all hard training is smart, but smart training is hard. I think that's a good rule to go by. If your training is not hard, it's probably not as smart as you think it is. The next thing, right? Let's say you're someone who likes to train hard, or you've figured out that you need to train hard. You've established that relationship of, I go to the gym, I try hard, I get stronger. I like that. That's what I like about lifting. I'm going to keep doing this. The next thing is being accountable with your outside the gym variables, right? Adaptation doesn't come from lifting weights. Lifting weights actually makes you weaker. It's the recovery and then super compensation that leads to adaptation and muscle hypertrophy and muscle strength. It's not the gym that makes you stronger. It's sleeping and eating that makes you stronger. We just need to first apply that sufficient stimulus, but then we need to go provide ourselves with the resources to see that super compensation. If you're really irresponsible with your outside the gym variables, you might make it back to recovered, but you're not going to see any meaningful super compensation, which means you're not actually going to get any stronger. And the way I view it is that you owe it to yourself to be at least pretty accountable with your outside the gym variables, because you're trying hard in the gym. You may as well reap the benefits by actually eating your meals. And I get pretty tired of people telling me that I've got God-tier genetics, right, and that they could never do that because it's entirely genetic, and strength is genetic. But it's some jackass who's eating 50 to 100 grams of protein as a 200-pound man. You're just lazy. You're dumb. You're not even doing the bare minimum, and then you're blaming your lack of results on genetics. Are genetics important? Absolutely. I reckon Max and I have pretty good genetics. But if you're not even doing the bare minimum, and then you're saying that strength is all genetic, you look like a jackass. So I think, and the other one is people constantly bragging about how little they sleep. It just means you're not taking it seriously. I don't understand. That's not really something I would brag about. If you've got school or you've got work, that's what puts money on the table, or that's what's going to put money on the table, I understand. But if you stayed up till 3 in the morning playing video games or watching Netflix, that's good and dandy. It's your own prerogative. But you have to acknowledge the reality, which is your actions say that you are prioritizing either Netflix or video games over getting stronger, which is not my priorities. And I think a lot of people would claim that's not their priorities, but their actions say otherwise. And then they get salty about their program not working, or they get salty at a bunch of other stupid shit when it's entirely their fault due to really, really dumb priorities. So I think that would be the second most common reason, is just people will train hard in the gym and then they'll go home and they'll just fuck around and do nothing right. unfortunately common. I think, the way I view it as like you owe it to yourself to some degree. I think makes it kind of sad. People will go put all this effort into the gym. They'll push themselves really hard, and they'll be like, "I'm gonna get this PR," but then they just don't do the easy stuff. Unfortunate, but also a very common reason people aren't progressing at the rate they would like to. The third reason is changing things too often, right? Program hopping. So you either don't even make it far enough into a program to know whether that program works, and then you never figure out what works for you. You never have this framework of, okay, I know for me, generally, these are the things I need to do when I want to push my squat. They're hard, so maybe I'm not doing these things at all time, but if I wanted to push for a squat PR, I kind of know how to do it. If you never stick with anything long enough to know whether it works, you'll never figure those things out. Or people will run through a training cycle, they'll be like, oh, I got good results. What do I do now? What program should I run next? That's People enjoy their training in different ways, so I don't want to sound too judgmental in this one, because there's nothing necessarily wrong with it, but it makes very little sense to me. If something works, do it again, unless you're just a absolute freak in nature. Right? I reckon Max and I have good genetics, but that's not how we got strong. We didn't go, this program added 50 pounds, then moved to an intermediate program, and then add 50 pounds, and then this program, 30-pound PR. It's been doing the exact same training cycle over and over and over and hitting a 5 or 10 pound PR every 9 to 12 weeks. Max, I consider a pretty good lifter, and I think that he got to that point because we ran the exact same squat training cycle over and over and over. It's about 10 weeks long for 3 years, and he had about 5 pounds per training cycle. Sometimes he would not PR for 3 blocks in a row, and then he would hit a 30-pound PR, so it averages out to a little bit less than 10 pounds per training cycle, so a good rate of progression, and we just kept going because we did feel that we were getting better each time, even if we weren't able to express it. So the foundation of strength is through repetition, right? Like repetitions of reps and then repetitions of training cycles, repetitions of meals, repetitions of hydration protocols, repetition of sleep. Everything is built on consistent repetition of good protocols. And this idea that like, okay, I finished the program, hit a 20-pound PR, and the immediate thought isn't, okay, awesome, I'm going to do it again, just confuses me. And I would say that's probably one of the most common things I see is just people program hopping or fiddling with their program too much. You need to run it through like vanilla the first time to figure out like what works and what doesn't work. If it worked, I wouldn't change anything on my second run through. And maybe if I PR'd my bench and I PR'd my squat, but I didn't PR my deadlift, okay, I would fiddle with the deadlift mechanics of the program, but I would not do so until I've completed it entirely. Like I went through a deload, I tested a new max, and now I know whether it worked. Just because you're weaker at one point because you've accumulated some fatigue when you were supposed to have accumulated fatigue doesn't mean the program isn't working. If you freak out and bail, you never get to actually experience the fruits of your labor for doing the program. So that would be my third one. My fourth one would be deficiency as far as technique, and this can be a spectrum either way. Like anything else, it does fall on a spectrum, and too far in one direction or the other probably represents some sort of deficiency. So you've got on one side kind of like what people trash squat you for, which is the guy who refuses to put any weight on the bar until his form is perfect. And that just leads to never pushing yourself hard. It leads to never just achieving progressive overload, which is kind of a core tenet of getting stronger. Good technique is important for getting stronger, but even more so, progressive overload is kind of the most important thing. So if you're so obsessed with your technique and any small deviation is a reason to deload to the bar, you're never going to be strong. And it does represent some form of deficiency. And the other side of the spectrum, you have the guy who loves pushing himself but won't hold himself accountable, starts cutting his squats high, bombs out of his meat, starts cutting range of motion on his accessories, so then you're not actually achieving true overload, as if you're decreasing your range of motion on each rep. The total mechanical work you're doing is going down per repetition, so did you really achieve true overload if you did an extra rep, but a ROM was cut on all of them? So you're not necessarily going to grow very well. They start jumping their pauses on their bench. If you start letting your being really unaccountable with your quality of motion. If I did good 3/4 presses and just didn't lock out any of my benches, I could crush a huge new 10RM. I'd be like, awesome, my 10RM went up 20 pounds. Can't wait for my 20-pound bench PR. I deserve this block. And then I peek out the block and I don't hit a PR. It's entirely my fault because I was training in a manner that was inflating my rep PRs and doesn't necessarily translate to the thing I want to do, which is a full range of motion bench press with a pause. So keeping yourself accountable, or your deadlift technique gets really shitty. You might be able to knock out a touch and go huge rep PR, but you're not training in a way that's going to translate to a 1RM and keeping yourself accountable for a high quality of motion. So I think too much deficiency in one direction or the other, as far as the technique goes, is a big one that I see very common at all the gyms I've gone to. I think that the next one, it would be not backing off the weight. And I kind of understand this one. I really get if you worked really hard to be able to bench 3 plates for some reps, you identify yourself as I'm a 3 plate bencher. I worked really hard for this. I put in more work than those 2 plate benchers who weigh the same amount as me. This is a point of pride. People won't back down their weight. They feel a need every session. They need to show that they are a 3 plate bencher, and they'll do a set at 3 plates. Even if reasonable percentages dictate they should be starting their training cycle accumulating volume at 255, they're only going to back down to 3 plates, and they're going to do so. Either they're going to let their form slip to get in volume at a higher percentage than they should be doing that amount of volume, or they're going to just not get in enough volume to drive significant adaptation because they will not go below that show off weight for them for any meaningful period of time, because they always need to show people what they're capable of. And I think that also ties into another problem I see, which is misuse of top singles. Top singles are absolutely great. Plenty of good lifters use them with plenty of success. I'm not going to tell you it isn't an effective training strategy, but I see a lot of intermediate and beginner lifters use top singles as an excuse to justify poor training, where they're like, okay, here's my 500-pound deadlift I do every single week. If you're doing the same top single every single week, you're not using them correctly. If you look at the people who are using them quite well, they look pretty submaximal for the majority of the year, right? There's some sort of built-in progression to either the RPE or the percentage attached to those singles, and they're not all RPE 10 showing everybody the exact same lift every week. So I think that would be another really common issue, is misuse of top singles, constantly overshooting because you want to show people what you're capable of, not necessarily build. And then the last thing would just be not placing enough priority on hypertrophy. If you look at like your class at USAPL Nationals, and everybody in your weight class is substantially shorter than you, more than likely you're in the wrong weight class. We can't all be a John Hack and win worlds at 183 at 5'10". It's just not how it works for the majority of us. We look to the majority, not the exception. That guy, he's squatting more than you. Why does he squat more than you? He's got bigger, stronger legs. So maybe we should invest some time into some basic hypertrophy focused motions, especially when you're more beginner, intermediate. When you're advanced, the amount of specificity needed to drive adaptation is high. You need a lot of specificity to improve your best result in this thing that you're very well trained in. When you're more of a beginner, different motions have a greater degree of transferability to other motions. So if you take your 3x10 hack squat and you add 50 pounds to your genuine 3 sets of 10, more than likely your squat went up. That might not be the case for the advanced guy, although that would be a very productive off-season to add 50 pounds to your best 3 sets of 10 on a hack squat. It's basically, I would say this one's less common than the other ones because everybody wants to be jacked, right? So I do see people prioritizing their hypertrophy, but I do notice that that's something a lot of people slack on, and I think that would be the last contributing factor to why people aren't seeing the progression they would like to. Hope the list is helpful.